Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christy Koenig, and I serve as the EMS Medical Director for the County of San Diego. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Veer Vithalani, the Base Hospital Medical Director for Palomar Health here in San Diego. And Dr. Vithalani was formerly the Chief Medical Officer, System Medical Director for the MedStar Mobile Healthcare System in Fort Worth, Texas. Today's lecture is entitled The Objective Perspective Using Cardiac Monitor Data to Improve EMS QA/QI. And this builds on the recently released County of San Diego Community Consensus Best Practice document that was created by our Cardiac Monitor Work Group. We look forward to Dr. Vithalani sharing his expertise, which is based on his long-standing interest and work in the areas of EMS, resuscitation, quality improvement, and data analytics. Over to you, Veer.
Great, thanks, Dr. Koenig. Let me see if I'm gonna share my screen. All right, you all see that okay?
Yes.
All right, great. Yeah, so thanks very much for having. Just by way of disclosure, you guys still hear me okay? It's telling me Zoom's quitting.
It was frozen for a second.
Okay.
You're cutting.
You may have better luck turning off your own camera.
How about now? Well, Zoom did not like that. All right. Second time. Can you guys see that?
Yes, we see it, Dr. Vithalani.
Yes.
All right, perfect. So, so just by way of disclosures, I have no financial interests or disclosures, but we're going to use sort of a case-based discussion today. And just by way of explanation, the cases are all relatively real cases. Obviously, the PHI has been changed, and it comes from a variety of systems that I've worked in over the past few years, and you'll see different monitor files, et cetera. So for the purpose of today's talk, I ask you to sort of put on your hat with an eye for quality improvement and quality assurance. That's sort of the perspective we're going to be taking as we go through these cases. And as Dr. K mentioned, I'm really pleased to see the work that the Monitor Data Work Group came out with the consensus guidance. And the section I'm going to really be focusing on is this one line out of the guidance in terms of 100% agency QA/QI review, including performance feedback to field personnel. And I hope that I'll be able to share some experiences that I've had sort of working on that line. So here's our objectives for today's talk. We're going to discuss the difference between what I call subjective and objective quality review. We're going to look at different clinical errors and areas for improvement that can be identified by including cardiac monitor file data as part of your QA/QI. And then we're going to talk about some ways to implement this in systems, whether it's your own system or on a bigger level. So we start off with a 43-year-old female who's found unconscious and unresponsive. She has a heart rate in the 80s, unable to obtain blood pressure. The respirations are agonal, pupils are sluggish, saturations are in the 50s. The ALS ambulance arrives on scene at about 3:36 in the morning. Shortly thereafter, they begin bag valve mask ventilation. The oxygen saturations start to improve. The heart rate's found to be in the 70s. They find an end-tidal CO2 in the high 80s. They begin to prepare for pre-hospital intubation. They recognize they weren't able to accomplish that, and they swiftly move the patient to the ambulance for transport to definitive care. At 3:52, a relatively short scene time, they load the patient in the ambulance, and they're preparing for another round of drug-assisted intubation. And this is all coming from the chart. At 4 o'clock, they note that CPR has begun and ACLS is performed en route to the hospital. And so, when we look at cases like this, I always used to receive patients like this in the ED, and I would typically think, well, this is obviously a very sick patient. There was not a whole lot we were going to be able to do. And this happens every day, to really, really sick patients. And so what I want to do is sort of dive into maybe a different perspective than what can just be gleaned out of the chart. So when we talk about QA/QI, there's a handful of tools we have at our disposal. So obviously there's the chart. If you have a computer dispatch record that you can evaluate to look at the 911 call or listen to the actual caller, there's obviously one of the most important aspects, which is the crew's account or recollection of the event. And then there's the cardiac monitor file. As you're all familiar, when you look at a cardiac monitor and you're using it real time, you get a lot of information. So you have, for example, the EKG rhythm, you have a measurement of CPR quality, you have the SpO2, including the waveform, and then waveform capnography if you're using it. And so for those of you who have not used sort of software-based analysis for your cardiac monitors, you get pretty much the exact same data when you look at it on the computer. So you get the EKG, whether it's coming from the pads or electrodes. You get some measure of CPR quality, and this depends on your monitor manufacturer as to whether it's being measured, and if so, what's required to actually measure it. Oftentimes they'll have a thing if the pads are on called the PCI, or the patient contact impedance. This is essentially electrical movement between the two pads, and it can be used to identify CPR periods, but also identify times of patient movement, and then end tidal CO2 if you're using it. And so we're going to go back to this case and look at it from sort of an objective perspective, looking at the cardiac monitor data. So at 3:40 a.m., when the ventilations were begun with bag valve mask ventilation, you can see you have a nice four-phase waveform with a relatively high reading. And that's an appropriate waveform I would consider for somebody undergoing bag valve mask ventilation. And here's the heart rate at that same time. At 3:48, when the intubation was unsuccessful and the patient was moved to the ambulance, you note that there is a pause in the end tidal CO2 because the patient is not being ventilated during the intubation attempt. And then when they begin moving and securing the patient in the ambulance, you see that for the rest of the actual movement to the truck, there's very poor ventilation actually occurring. And so when you talk to the crew and you look at the PCR, there is documentation that we're performing bag valve mask ventilation. But when you look at it objectively, there may be, I'm not sure if you can see my finger pointer here, but you have small waveforms in the fourth line there where you're attempting to perform ventilation, but it's nothing like what you were doing when you weren't moving the patient. And you can identify that you're moving the patient because that PCI channel starts to get very erratic, and that's sort of how it looks when you're moving someone around. And so you note at this same time that the heart rate actually begins to slow during this period as well. And then one thing that you can note by scrolling through the entire monitor file and a vital sign that was not captured in the PCR was that at 3:52, the patient's getting profoundly more bradycardic. And then during that time where the patient was being secured into the ambulance and being prepared for a second round of intubation, this was their EKG rhythm. And at 4 a.m., when they note CPR has started, you can see that again on the PCI channel with that rhythmic chest wall movement from chest compressions. And then, of course, they placed the pads on the patient already, and so you can also see it on the pads. And so, obviously it was a very sick patient, but there are some learning points that can be gleaned from this. So one, obviously, there was an intubation attempt with a very low oxygen saturation. They began pre-oxygenating the patient using bag valve mask ventilation, but the SpO2 really didn't improve, and trying to intubate someone who is profoundly hypoxic is generally not a good idea. And then there was this focus on moving the patient to the ambulance after that intubation attempt, instead of addressing the oxygenation and ventilation that was not happening. And so there is a several minute period there where the patient is presumed to be receiving bag valve mask ventilation, but the objective data of the capnography waveform shows you that they're actually not ventilating air, and thus the patient becomes more and more hypoxic. And again, when it comes to moving the patient to the ambulance, there's a lot of time and attention paid to the actual movement and doing so in a safe manner. And it's very easy to lose sight of how sick your patient is. And you can presume that it only takes a few minutes to load someone in. But what you can see through the cardiac monitor file is, in this instance, there was about 8 minutes of asystole before any CPR was begun. And there was distractions for IV placements and preparing for drug-assisted intubation. And again, not sort of paying attention to the monitor. So this leads me to a concept that I've been talking about for a few years, that in my old position we referred to as SADS, or sudden ambulance death syndrome. To us, it was a syndrome of critically ill patients who deteriorate quickly in the back of or on the way to the ambulance. And it's typically the result of a failure to do one of a few things. One is to stabilize a patient prior to moving them from the scene. to recognize and treat respiratory insufficiency and failure. A very common one is prior to a failure to prioritize life-saving interventions, and then recognizing, interpreting, and treating lethal dysrhythmias. And so I think a sort of notion that has existed in the past that's being challenged now is the concept that load and go in certain instances can actually be a lethal movement, and that there's actually care that needs to be provided prior to securing the patient into an ambulance for transport. So another case, 55-year-old male found unconscious with agonal respirations. We have ALS ambulance arriving on scene. They connect end tidal CO2 and again begin assisting the ventilations with a bag valve mask at about 10 beats per minute. They note in their documentation a palpable pulse with a heart rate in the 40s and SpO2 in the 40s, a very low end tidal CO2, and again they prepare for intubation. They note that the intubation is successful. It's confirmed with breath sounds and absent epigastric sounds. They're unable to get an end tidal CO2 reading due to occlusion, due to excessive fluids. And so they note a few minutes later that the heart rate and SpO2 is still low, and about a minute thereafter, CPR is begun. And so again, when we look at this using the cardiac monitor file, at the time that they connected their end tidal CO2 and began bag valve mask ventilation, you see that that ventilation was actually very sporadic and actually not giving them the sort of ventilations that they thought that were being administered. This is a zoomed in version of a few of the ventilations that you can see, small amount of CO2 movement, but not anything that would resemble a standard 4-phase waveform. And here's that heart rate at the same time. Again, you have a notation that the intubation is successful, and unfortunately, this is the end tidal CO2 waveform after that procedure. I think most of us would recognize that that's an unrecognized filled airway. So here is the heart rate that very quickly decompensates into asystole, which is immediately recognized and CPR has begun. In this instance, a field supervisor actually showed up and recognized the misplaced ET tube, replaced it with a supraglottic airway, and you get that 4-phase waveform. And I really include this for the express purpose that oftentimes one of the presumed rationales for a flat end tidal CO2 waveform is that the patient's cardiac output is so low, or that they have some metabolic derangement or respiratory issue or pulmonary embolism, for example, in which they are physically incapable of providing CO2. But we note in majority of cases that I've looked at that that's actually not the case. And this is one example where they establish effective ventilation subsequently, and you can see a good 4-phase waveform. So again, a learning point of inadequate oxygenation ventilation prior to an intubation attempt. One thing that we took away from a lot of the work we've done in this arena in our system is that for really any ventilation in a critically ill patient, no end tidal CO2 means there's no ventilation. And if you think you're ventilating with BVM, you should be using a CO2 detector to identify whether or not it's actually working. And if it's not working, then the BVM is not working. And so in my previous system, we had a pretty much gold standard that if you were ventilating for the patient, anything from 2 liters of nasal cannula up, that it would have measured CO2, and you would act on any flatline waveform, because whereas unrecognized failed endotracheal intubation is something that's talked about a lot, there's actually a lot of unrecognized failed supraglottic airway placements, unrecognized failed bag valve mask ventilation, etc. And so the other sort of discussion point that I would come on a lot is that, there is a frank misunderstanding oftentimes about the difference between an occluded end tidal CO2 detector or an occluded endotracheal tube, for example, that from vomitus in the airway or significant secretions, and that of a misplaced tube. And there is a fundamental difference in the monitor file that you can see when you have a CO2 occlusion and no air and thus no carbon dioxide is reaching the detector. You get a dashed line as opposed to a solid line, which tells you that there is 0 partial pressure of CO2 in the device. I unfortunately couldn't include it, but one of my former colleagues actually stuck an endotracheal tube in a bag of salsa that he had breathed into and ventilated through that, and found that actually you can get end tidal CO2 despite large volumes of liquid, including your endotracheal tube. And so we don't usually rely on excessive secretions as a rationale for a flatline end tidal CO2. 61-year-old female found at a nursing home with altered mental status. The nursing home says that they weren't able to palpate a carotid pulse when they went to check on her, they were able to palpate a carotid pulse when they went to check on her, but she was unresponsive and they couldn't get a blood pressure, but they're not really sure for how long she was down. ALS ambulance arrives on scene, takes a little while to get to the patient because it's a facility. Here's the vital signs that they document: heart rate of 125, blood pressure of 50 over palp, SpO2 of 73, a low respiratory rate, normal glucose, and a GCS of 3. So they place the patient on a non-rebreather mask at a high flow rate and start working through their patient care. The first thing is that set of vital signs, as I mentioned. A few minutes later, they've been focusing on IV placement in the left arm, which unfortunately was unsuccessful. A couple of minutes later, they try in the other arm, and that was successful. They note a few minutes thereafter that her heart rate is significantly improved. Her respiratory rate remains the same. The SpO2 is not really able to be picked up anymore, but her blood pressure is not changing. They place the patient on the cardiac monitor, including the defibrillator pads appropriately based on how sick she was. And again, a few minutes later, they note that her heart rate is now normalized, even though her SpO2 and her blood pressure really are not moving anywhere. At 127, she's moved to the ambulance now that she is on the cardiac monitor and they have non-rebreather and IV fluids established. And at 130, CPR has begun in the ambulance when they notice that she is pulseless. And so one thing we picked up from the narrative that really summarizes a lot of the concept behind SADS is this statement that we would see time and time again, which is that assisted ventilations were about to start, but the patient went into asystole. And then they note that bag valve mask ventilation occurred for the remainder of the case to the hospital. So again, pulling the monitor file on this, 109 at the initial vitals, this is from the chart. And we see that that's pretty accurate there, fast heart rate and low blood pressure. Of note, this patient in our system would have required end-tidal CO2 from the beginning, and they did not use it in this instance. The subsequent set of vitals, 113 here, 123, you can see that her heart rate is definitely slowing down. At 127, at the time that the patient was being loaded into the ambulance, this is what her heart rate looked like. And then approximately 90 seconds later, this is what her heart rate looked like. At 134, they document successful bag valve mask ventilation, but this is actually their CO2 waveform throughout the case. There was some question as to whether the detector truly ended up on the patient or on the floor, but for at least that primary portion before the gap in the third line, this was the bag valve mask that was being performed here, which we, again, would term an unrecognized failed bag valve mask ventilation. So again, initially you arrive to a patient who is has suffering from respiratory insufficiency. It's treated with high flow oxygen, but not positive pressure ventilation. There's no measurement of their end-tidal CO2. There's this lack of appropriate prioritization in terms of the interventions that need to be performed. And so there was a lot of emphasis placed on IV placement and moving the patient to the ambulance, despite the hemodynamic instability. There was really no assessment of adequacy of ventilation with the bag valve mask ventilation. And again, another case where a few minutes on scene may have actually resulted in a different outcome. And then the last case I'll share with you is an 80-year-old male who has an unwitnessed mechanical fall, denies any complaints, has no real signs of injury on a relatively normal brief exam. There are the vital signs that you gather from the EPCR. And the patient refuses any further evaluation, says he doesn't want to make a fuss, and refuses transport and signs an AMA. And the vital signs are relatively within normal limits, except for some hypertension, of which he has a history of hypertension, and an elevated respiratory rate. While the crew is outside charting their AMA, they are called back in by the patient's family because the patient has now lost consciousness. They arrive and find him to be unresponsive, bradycardic with a respiratory rate in the 60s. They begin bag valve mask ventilation, move him to the ambulance, where they arrive and find him in asystole. They begin CPR and transport him to the hospital. So here is again the cardiac monitor file. This is a slightly different brand. At 9:55 on initial evaluation, you see the vital signs that are noted there: 170 over 73, heart rate of 76. The documentation did not entirely match up with the cardiac monitor file. The cardiac monitor file showed an SpO2 of 87% with a good waveform. And at 10:10, they performed the AMA. When the monitor was turned back on at 10:27, they find him in a supremely bradycardic rhythm at a rate of 30. They get their first oxygen saturation at 47% with an unreliable waveform. At that point, his heart rate is in the 20s. And they initiate bag valve mask ventilation, but again, did not use end-tidal CO2 to ensure the adequacy of their ventilation. Shortly thereafter, you note again that his SpO2 is in the 60s. They're continuing to do BVM per their documentation. The heart rate is in the 20s. At 10:35, something curious happens, and a really unfortunate habit that my old system had, which was the monitor was disconnected so that the patient could be loaded onto the cot and transported out to the ambulance. At the time of disconnection, his heart rate was in the 20s, and his SpO2 had an unreliable waveform. They state they were performing bag valve mask ventilation en route to the ambulance. Takes about 5 minutes to get them loaded into the ambulance and reconnected to the cardiac monitor, at which point they note that he is asystolic with a low SpO2. Again, they continue bag valve mask ventilation, and at 10:44, 4 minutes or so after the asystole actually was first documented on the monitor, they start CPR, and that's evident by the, again, compression waveform that you can see on the cardiac monitor. So again, there's obviously a number of items identified in this case. The patient was actually hypoxic during his initial AMA. The chart actually had some deficiencies as well in terms of the airway and breathing assessment. They documented bag valve mask ventilation, but there was no true utilization of end-tidal CO2. SpO2 never really improved. And then again, this movement of the patient, despite them being critically unwell, and this sort of disconnection of the monitor with unrecognized decompensation. And so, again, this led us really, after seeing several of these cases, to do a study. We had been identifying cases like this, and so we did a sort of prospective flagging of cases. And so we did a retrospective review of all of these cases. We did a sort of blinded two-reviewer analysis and abstracted as much data as we could, and then sort of tried to look for patterns and see what we could do to improve this in our system. So we identified 30 cases over a couple-year period. There was a relatively even male-female split with a mean age of 63 or so. Most patients had several comorbidities. Really, one of the biggest things that we were able to pick out of here was SpO2 monitoring. So for patients with on initial evaluation, only 12 of them had a reliable SpO2 waveform, with only 5 of them being within a normal range. 13 had an unreliable waveform, and in 5 cases, there was no SpO2 that was able to be measured initially. And then we compared that to the time period immediately prior to patient movement to the ambulance, in which cases only 5 cases had a reliable waveform. 3 of these were with a normal oxygen saturation. 17 had an unreliable waveform. All of 1 had initially started as unreliable or hypoxic, and in 8 cases, it was not measured. And one thing that we noted as well is that in 32% of cases where a patient was hypoxic or had an unreliable waveform, or in which it was not measured, they never actually received any oxygen prior to their sort of development into cardiac arrest. And so we looked especially at need for ventilation assessment. Again, this is using the totality of evidence available to us. In those 30 cases, we deemed that 80% of them needed assisted ventilation, and that's essentially by reading the chart, we know, or looking at the monitor file, we noted guppy breathing or a low respiratory rate with poor tidal volume. And unfortunately, 9 of them did not receive it prior to them going into cardiac arrest. Of the 15 cases which did get bag valve mask ventilation, we were able to analyze the end-tidal CO2 waveforms, and 8 were not deemed successful. And so again, they were performing bag valve mask ventilation, but it wasn't actually causing any ventilation to occur. And 11 of those 15 were deemed delayed, with a median time to BVM of about 15 minutes, compared to a median time to loss of vitals of about 18 minutes. And so what this came to realize is we start talking about almost this snowball effect, where by the time you're able to identify and recognize that the patient is traveling very quickly downhill towards cardiac arrest, it's almost too late sometimes if you're not aggressive really early on in your care. Of the 30 cases, we had a loss of vital signs first seen on the cardiac monitor in 6 cases during patient movement, but the rest were in the ambulance. And the mean time to loss of vital signs was 8 minutes and 16 seconds from crew arriving on scene. 8 minutes and 16 seconds for patients who lost vitals during movement, and 22 minutes for patients who lost vitals in the ambulance. And so again, trying to glean some information here, crews who show up and leave the scene with a critically unwell patient within 8 minutes oftentimes had not started enough life-saving interventions to prevent cardiac arrest en route to the ambulance even, and that was a common theme that we had seen. Of note, half of the patients who lost vital signs during movement did not receive their first compression until it was recognized in the ambulance. And again, this speaks to that that sort of unintentional blind spot that happens when you're walking the patient from their house to the ambulance. It feels like only a couple minutes, but in those couple minutes, some really disastrous events can occur. All of the cases were transported to an emergency department. We had sustained pre-hospital ROSC in about 7 cases. 19 were pronounced in the ED. 11 patients were admitted to the hospital. 9 of them subsequently died in the hospital. Of the 2 discharged alive, 1 went to rehab and 1 went to hospice, and they both had a CPC score of 2. And so, the conclusion that we took from our little study was that the failure to identify and correct clinical instability before moving a patient from a 911 scene to an ambulance can result in sudden decompensation into cardiac arrest. And we talk a lot that if you fail to assess or utilize your cardiac monitoring, you could be pushing the patients at risk. And I think we've spoken a lot. There's been a lot of pendulum swinging between trusting, your treating your patient and not your monitor, but that can go in the wrong direction where you ignore the warning signs that the monitor is giving you and presume the patient's actually better off than they are. One big thing is the unreliable SpO2 waveform, really, in our opinion, should be treated like as if it's hypoxic, because the worst thing that happens is you excessively oxygenate a patient who otherwise was not with a normal oxygen saturation. But the worst thing that happens is that you are way behind by the time you recognize that they are truly, truly profoundly hypoxic, and it's very difficult to fix otherwise. And in our experience, when you can appropriately recognize and institute deliberate and time-sensitive resuscitation measures, you can prevent this decompensation into cardiac arrest. And so we consider SADS to be a predictable and preventable occurrence, but it's something that if you don't look in your system, you may not ever know. It's a blind spot in many systems clinical care. And if you're not using your cardiac monitor data to look for these cases, you may not know that they're actually ever occurring. And the whole point of this abstract and the whole point of this discussion is that you need to implement detailed quality assurance processes, and that allows you to identify these cases and work to improve them. The whole goal of quality improvement is to actually overall improve the quality of care, not anything else. And so what did we do? What did I have the luxury of doing in some of my previous systems? So much like the community consensus guidelines, it starts with a protocol and procedure. So there were several places where we talk about the requirement to upload cardiac monitor data to the ePCR. We instituted essentially mandatory use of waveform capnography, as I mentioned, really for anything above the level of simple nasal cannula. So if it's bag valve mask ventilation, supraglottic airway, endotracheal tube, even CPAP, or we had implemented sort of flow-based bilevel pressure, any of that required end-tidal CO2. And we actually made end-tidal CO2 interpretation a BLS level skill in our system, because it was really, in our opinion, everyone's responsibility to ensure that a patient was being adequately ventilated, regardless of who was performing the actual skill. And oftentimes our EMTs are the ones performing the bag valve mask ventilation and should be able to interpret the CO2 waveform. And then on the operational side, instituting operational policy with as well as the sort of just culture process where monitor files are uploaded, and that allows the medical side to actually perform the necessary review of those cases. And so we started with really a simple sentence that said, hey, if your patient is really sick, or you haven't done everything in your power to try and improve their hemodynamic space, don't move them to the ambulance, and at least implement your interventions. And almost predictably, that didn't work perfectly for us. And so we eventually morphed this into what we call our crashing patient protocols. The crashing patient protocols really pull from the concept of early goal-directed therapy, if you're familiar from the sepsis world, but also some great work that was done out of Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania state protocols, looking at what to do with these critically unwell patients. And the concept is simple, is that we're not asking everyone to stay on scene and provide definitive care for critically unwell patients who obviously need to go to the hospital. But on the flip side, if you don't stop and take deliberate measures to try and fix the things you can fix that will prevent your patient from going into cardiac arrest en route in the hospital, you're putting them at risk. And so we set out these respiratory and circulatory goals both for medical and for trauma, as well as a distinct line as to when it's okay to transport the patient, whether it's to load them into the ambulance or transport them into the patient or transport them in the ambulance to the hospital. And I'm happy to share these or talk through them with anyone in more detail offline. Obviously, you need resources to do this sort of work. So whatever monitor manufacturer brand you have, they all have software that allows you to do the retrospective review. This also includes the need for whether it's cloud-based or PCR storage solutions. You need a way to gather these files and then to review them. And then obviously you need people. And this is a couple pictures of the team I was had the privilege of leading over in Fort Worth. You need people to be able to do the actual work and look at the files and actually understand what's going on and to draw conclusions from what they're seeing, merging not only the PCR, but with the cardiac monitor file. And so just one example of the QA/QI process that we had in my former system, bar none, the most important step is to consider QA/QI an educational activity and not a punitive activity. It is there again to sort of rise to the tides and raise all ships. For the cases that we used to review, everything went through sort of bidirectional operational and medical review that included 100% of cardiac arrest, any airway management, and any high-risk diagnosis. We would gather the chart and the CAD and the monitor file, assign it a priority, and then meet with the crew, again, with the purpose of education. I think in every chart, in every case that is treated by a human, which is for now all of us, there is always room for improvement, whether it's small, medium, or large improvement. There's always something that can be done better. And this sort of involved approach allowed us to not only identify where those areas for improvements were, but really figure out whether they were system issues as opposed to individual issues. We would assign dispositions and institute what we call clinical improvement plans. But again, the most important thing was to identify what needed more education and develop education from that. And when you implement a process like this, you can get really great change. So this is an example of when we first implemented the requirement to upload the cardiac monitor files into the chart. This is over a 4 or 5 year period, but for the most part, barring any major IT issues, this worked well. And then, speaking to the unrecognized failed airways, the system I was in before had a really unfortunately high rate initially of unrecognized failed supraglottic airway placements. And I sort of spoke to that before, and it started actually in the 15 to 20% range, which was really unfortunate and really scarily high. And so this is a run chart representing the work that we did over the sort of 5 year period from when we first identified it, with a few points there. And really, again, I would almost suggest to all of you who use any sort of supraglottic airway to do a random chart sampling and see whether or not you have any cases of this. We didn't believe it in our system until we started to see it. And as a few of my friends say in the quality improvement world, it's you can say that you have a high intubation success rate. You can say you have a 0% unrecognized failed airway rates as long as you can bring the receipts. And so this is one way to do that, is with a sort of independent review of the cardiac monitor file. As we would develop these educational components, obviously we talk about the knowledge, ability, and sort of confidence, so the cognitive, manual, and affective skills. We would spend a lot of time with our crews working on the knowledge, and manual skills weren't really the issue, but the major one that we saw a lot of was the concept of really the sort of confidence level, the affective skills, and especially in systems where you may have teams from different departments, whether that's a separate first response and transport agency, as opposed to a single department that provides both first response and transport. There's a lot of collaborative work that needs to be done to have everyone on the same page, to have everyone the same, have the same level of trust in each other, and really only when that happens can you really start to make some good movement, because if everyone's operating off of different understandings of the same protocol, you can definitely lead to trouble. And so getting everyone on the same page and operating in a team approach was an important step in this. And the big thing that we really pushed on, especially when it comes to SADS and unrecognized failed airways, is that with these critically ill patients, oftentimes all you have are seconds to minutes to act. And again, I have a stack of these cases that I used to keep. as examples of the fact that when you show up and someone's saturations are really low and the respiratory is really low, it's why EMS exists in the first place. It's why we exist to help take care of patients in the field. It's why there is a scope of practice. It's because you have this whole toolbox that you don't need to get to the bottom of it on every case. But if you have someone who is very, very sick, thankfully you have the tools at your disposal to try to stabilize them so that they can safely make it to the hospital. And so the one warning I will give is once you start looking at cardiac monitor files, you will find things that you did not realize were there in your system. And I experienced that a lot, is you will start to see things that you didn't even know exist. And that's where how we sort of identified SADs and unrecognized airways in our system, and a few other sort of items. And so just to sort of round out the discussion, we talked about SADs, we talked about unrecognized airways, and again, when it comes to waveform capnography review, it's really not even just about endotracheal tubes and supraglottic airways, but even down to spontaneous respirations. If you have a patient who's on CPAP, it's very easy to lose the fact that they are starting to slow their respirations and not take as good of a ventilatory effort. And sometimes you need that extra set of data to start pushing you towards bag valve mask ventilation as opposed to leaving them on CPAP. And again, just sort of utilizing all the tools at your disposal. And so the last part I want to touch on in terms of things you can use by utilizing cardiac monitor files is obviously kind of what they were designed for, which is the cardiac arrest metrics. And so for those of you familiar with analyzing sort of CPR waveform files and getting CPR report cards. This is one example of a CPR report card. If you were to take a glance at this, you would probably realize that the CCF is probably in the 80%. I think officially this was 81% or so. But those of you with a keen eye who having looked at this before, you'll note that there are several very long pauses in this case. And if you note the little orange triangles, those are defibrillations. You can see there that there were some pretty long pre-shock pauses, which we know that a long pre-shock pause is actually very detrimental to patient outcome. You see down in the roughly 30-minute mark, there's almost a 2-minute delay where there was no CPR being performed. In that instance, again, that was actually movement of the patient to the ambulance, which in this instance was also an inappropriate decision as an aside. But again, where it's there's a lot of information that can be gleaned. And so I would like to think that most of our report cards look like this, especially in this case, which is with a mechanical compression device, or what we call an MCD. As you can see, you have a 97% CCF, 99% in target depth, 99% in target rate, and overall, a 98% appropriate compression rate. And that's really great, and how a lot of them would look. Much like a lot of systems in 2020, there was how should I say it? There was extra funding available for departments, and a lot of departments use those fundings to purchase mechanical compression devices to really initially improve crew safety in the early days of COVID, and really trying to minimize crew sort of exposure to cardiac arrest patients who may have been COVID positive. And so almost overnight, as you can see, my previous system jumped from 17% of cases using a mechanical compression device to almost 80% of cases using a mechanical compression device. And so when you really think about it, right, there's 5 critical components to high quality CPR: minimizing interruptions, doing good rate, good depth, avoiding leaning between compressions, and avoiding excessive ventilations. And when you bring in a mechanical compression device, you're really eliminating those middle 3 components. They provide great rate and depth, and they recoil quite well. But what we started to see in our cardiac arrest report cards were tracings that looked like this, where if you look at the depth line, you see sort of a nice initial round of CPR, and then little by little, that depth is getting shallower and shallower and shallower all the way down, and then it turns from blue to gray there. And through a series of investigations, including some work with the manufacturers, what we really came to realize is when you look at a plane, for example, you can have various movements. So you can have the roll, you can have the pitch change, and you can yaw on an axis. And really, this is no different than a mechanical compression device. They can rotate around, they can lean back and forth, and they can slide sort of around on the patient's chest, especially if not used 100% according to the manufacturer's recommendations. And so we identified this thing that we termed MCD Walk, and this was where an MCD essentially moves out of place during a resuscitation and leads to inadequate chest compression depth. And so as you see here in another example, it starts off at an adequate depth and slowly makes its way down. And when you reach a certain level, depending on your monitor manufacturer, when you reach a certain level, you can actually provide compressions that are at such a shallow depth that the monitor will actually turn off the CPR mode because it believes you are no longer doing chest compressions. And if you really think about that, these devices are implemented in order to provide high quality CPR, and they do, again, as long as they are watched and made sure that they are being used according to manufacturer recommendations. And so again, we did a study looking at the incidence of this. We pulled just over a year's worth of cardiac arrest. We had about 1,400 cardiac arrests. We had 68% that had been placed on an MCD. Standard sort of ages between the patient and, I'm sorry, 80% were placed on an MCD. Walk occurred in about 31% of our MCD placements. And so you see 360 there out of 1,130 cardiac arrests. So a 30% rate of MCD walk, which really, again, is something we only identified by using our cardiac monitor files and tracking and trending them over time. And so we've sort of come up with some best practices that are relatively straightforward, actually, but again, require methodical implementation. So the first is to monitor your compression depth on the monitor. And one thing that a lot of systems that implement MCDs don't do is thus, they remove their actual compression feedback device. So if you're using the Zoll, for example, the little puck that goes underneath, oftentimes that's removed in order to place an MCD. Similarly with Philips not exactly having one, and et cetera, et cetera. But there's, and we've gone back and forth with the monitor manufacturers onto this and done cadaver and pig and suction studies as well. But you can place, especially a DefibTech LifeArm on a Zoll X Series puck, for example, and it will actually measure accurately the patient's chest movement. And so the next thing we say is, once you've gotten it seated in the correct position, use a Sharpie just to draw a circle around where the piston is so that you can recognize immediately if it's sliding out of place. And then really we encourage the use of what we call an MCD watcher, just someone who can sit there as part of their role in the cardiac arrest to keep an eye on the depth, make sure that the device isn't sliding out of place, and to really keep one hand on it so that it doesn't lean back and forth. One of the really biggest things that we noticed in the analysis that we did was that the neck strap is a frequently lost piece of the device, as well as the arm straps are oftentimes go underutilized because the arms are being used for IV access or something else. But again, to maintain manufacturer recommendations, the patient needs to be on a neck strap and have their arms up on the sides of the piston-driven device. And so we actually went as far as to say that if your neck strap was missing, then the device is out of service, because we recognize that this was a major cause of the device leaning backwards, which is why the neck strap exists in the first place. And then again, through education and other things, learning to recognize, to identify MCD work or anticipate it after certain maneuvers. So defibrillation is a common cause that subsequently leads to MCD walk, moving the patient, obviously. And then during transport, as was mentioned before, you have sort of a rickety transport. You may end up dislodging the device and not getting it in where it is. And so it is possible to implement programs where you identify and correct this walk. You'll note there at the sort of 1625 mark, the MCD had fallen below its appropriate depth. It was paused for a brief period of time, readjusted, placed back in the center of the chest, re-implemented, and subsequently had great CPR performance throughout the rest of the case. And so this is the sort of corrected MCD walk that we talk about. And then sort of on a similar thread, the secondary problem we had a lot of with MCD Walk was sort of delayed placement time. So again, excessive pauses associated with placing the device. A lot of systems implement a one-step approach to placing the device, where during one pause of CPR, both the backplate and the compression device are placed on. And that is definitely one way of effectively performing this, but it takes a lot of choreography and really skilled movements. And in the washroom of a multifamily unit where there is very minimal space and a very large patient, it is very difficult sometimes to get all the people there for the choreography. And so we implemented a two-step application where we would place the backplate on one pause, perform another round of CPR, and then place the actual mechanical compression device again. And if it wasn't able to be done in 10 seconds, to really just abort the application. And again, this really helped us with minimizing our placement times. And so again, just when it comes to MCDs, if you're not measuring your placement time, if you're not measuring your CPR metrics, I would encourage you to do so. Use like everything I've sort of talked about, if you don't look, you probably won't find it. And if you do look, you'll see a lot of stuff where you can definitely improve your overall patient care by identifying things that you didn't realize were there before. So with that, there is my email address. I'm happy to talk through any of this in more detail. If anyone needs help sort of looking through monitor files or wants to learn how to implement that into their system, or has any suggestions for me on other things to look for, then I really appreciate that. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vithalani, for that outstanding lecture. It's going to be very helpful to inform our QA/QI process, and the cases were very illustrative. Excellent identification of the basics and how we measure them. I always think measure, improve, and to avoid things like unrecognized failed airways. I always say it's ventilation, not intubation. And that's going to be especially important as we move forward towards exploring the use of supraglottic airways in our system. And appreciate the emphasis on the just culture and the education. I do see one question in the chat from Jason. Could you please speak a bit more on the monitoring chest compression quality via the Zoll X series puck when also using a Lucas? And he says that their Lucas rep stated that Lucas will not be able to accomplish active when using the two devices together.
Yeah, no, so great point. And actually just last month at the NAMSP conference, we've actually met with Stryker's, Mike Levy, who's their CMO, and then also we ended up on a call with some of their sort of engineers out of Sweden. They did some extra studies for us on sort of the suction. And so the important thing to understand is the wire leading to the Zoll X series puck does break the seal of the Lucas suction cup. And so that's something that I think is well known. In our system, we did have Lucases, but primarily we're with the defib tech. I think there is it's a bit of a I always used to call it like Schrodinger's MCD walk. You don't know it's there unless you look for it, and it's a bit of a risk benefit trade-off. The Stryker Lucas, it does perform active decompression only to zero station, and zero station doesn't have as much evidence, for example, compared to -1 or -2 station, which is what the European Lucases do. I would say that it is a bit of a risk benefit trade-off in terms of whether that active decompression is necessary, as opposed to whether or not you're performing adequate CPR. And so, we implemented it in the past, regardless of monitor manufacturer brand. We implemented it with the Lucas. We did not see any major changes to our outcomes by using the Zoll puck underneath it, but we did see MCD Walk with the Lucas device. And so again, whether it's something that is done, on a trial basis to see, or if you look for alternative means of evaluating your depth, whether that's with, just looking at your cardiac output via end-tidal CO2 or other things. But you're right, there is a bit of a balance there, specifically with the Lucas and the Zoll.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that comprehensive information. Todd has a question.
Hey, doctor, I just wanted to see if you were able to identify patients that after resuscitative efforts, they were showing some EMD or electrical, activity that wasn't typically sustained once they got en route. I think this is kind of a blind spot we have here where the urgency to transport with some response, even though there may not be pulse and blood pressure. Do you have a way of tracking that or dealing with those patients?
So the way we handled it, we sort of talked a lot about a post-ROSC protocol in our old system. And what we really did instead was sort of funneled them into our crashing patient protocol. So our crashing patient protocol has really just one respiratory goal and one circulatory goal, which is that you either have to have an oxygen saturation over 94% or an advanced airway in place. And then from a circulatory goal, you either had to have an systolic pressure over 90 or vasopressors in place. And so, again, it gives an out, but it makes you ensure that you've taken the right steps towards hemodynamic stability. We definitely saw cases where cardiac arrests would get a ROSC, and then yes, there would be such a pressure, whether internal or external or otherwise, to rush those patients from the scene that they didn't get their 12 lead or they didn't get their blood pressure stabilized, and then they would decompensate again en route. That was definitely something that we saw.
So is it safe to say you do not transport unless
So you're cutting out a little bit, but I'm assuming you said we don't transport until their hemodynamics are improved for a post-ROSC patient. Yeah, my previous system in the past had a 10-minute cutoff. I don't really believe in time cutoffs per se, but I believe in objective measurement. So if you have adequate oxygenation, ventilation, at least as best as you're going to be able to accomplish, and adequate cardiac output as best as you're going to be able to accomplish, that's the point at which it's safe to transport that patient post-cardiac arrest. It is definitely not the moment you get a ROSC and then quickly package them and take them to the hospital, because it does put you and the patient at risk, in my opinion.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Duncan, I see your hand. Go ahead, please.
Hey, good afternoon, Dr. Vithalani. Thanks so much for a phenomenal lecture, and it's so timely on so many pieces that Dr. K has already mentioned. A couple of quick questions, if I may. One, really interested in your supraglottic 30% failure rate identified. Wondering what device you were using, and was there kind of a typical sort of failure? Did the device fold back? Did you identify one or two pieces for improvement, or was it sort of scattered?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Duncan. Yeah, so actually, it shocked us too, and so much that we actually wrote it up in resuscitation, and it really revolved around one of a few things. The predominance of the cases were in cardiac arrest, and so there was a presumption that the patient already had a low cardiac output, or that really one of the common discussion points was that the presumption on behalf of the crew was that secretions were occluding the end-tidal detector. And again, we talked about that flat line versus dashed line. That was a major teaching point for us. Interestingly, the folks out of New Mexico, I think, did some post-mortem CTs, and what we came to identify, we were using the King LT is the primary supraglottic that we were using. It really came to one of two things. They were either inserted too deep, in which case the hypopharyngeal balloon was occluding the tracheal opening. And if you, again, read the modern manufacturer or the manufacturer recommendations, they say insert it deep and then pull it back until you get breath sounds or end-tidal CO2. And that step was lacking. Or it was curling in the oropharynx, and then it wasn't adequately occluding the hypopharynx, or the tracheal, or the esophageal balloon was occluding the tracheal opening. It was typically one or the other. They were either too deep or they were too shallow. And those were the majority of them. It wasn't really, and again, a lot of it was skills practice, but then it was also this mentality that if you have a flatline end-tidal CO2, pull the device out and perform bag valve mask ventilation until you can, place another airway device.
Copy. Thank you very much. And just one quick comment, if I may, for our EMTs and medics on the call, that please don't lump everything together with trauma as well. This is also pertinent for cardiac arrest, but in trauma, we really want to try and manage the airways that we can en route. We found in the air ambulance world, we managed airways on scene at typically doubled the scene time. So I just want to draw, sort of two different categories for folks on the call. Thanks very much.
No, great point. And actually, to that end, we do have a separate, the crashing patient trauma protocol was much more abbreviated, and the goals were a lot more. So, for example, the circulatory goal was much more en route. But the one caveat I'll say, and I do strongly believe this, if you have a trauma patient, a major trauma patient who is critically hypoxic at the point at which you arrive, in my opinion, and in all the cases I looked at, taking a couple extra minutes to ensure adequate oxygenation and ventilation, even just with bag valve mask ventilation, can prevent that patient from going into cardiac arrest. And when I had this conversation with all my local trauma surgeons, it was, hey, I can bring you a hypoxic corpse, or I can bring you a patient 5 minutes later. And truly, we had some really bad traumas with major saves just by implementing a couple extra minutes. And even then, I won't go into the golden hour debate and everything else, but we're not talking about intubation and drug-assisted intubation and finger thoracostomies and all of that stuff. We're talking about bag the patient with adequate ventilation and oxygenation, and decompress the chest en route if you really need to. And those are the major points. But yeah, again, very different.
Great, Doc. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Excellent. Andy Fisher, you have a question?
I was just really quick. Where you were at, did you guys have a specific post-ROSC protocol? I know for us, we're monitoring all the vitals and everything and making sure there's not any change, but was there any specific guidelines in terms of initiating pressors early or any intervention in the transport?
Yeah, so no, we did talk about it, and I think towards the end of my time there, we had plans to implement it. We funneled everyone back to crashing patient trauma, the crashing patient medical protocol. So if you had a ROSC patient who was profoundly hypoxic, at that point, they probably would have had an advanced airway, including a supraglottic airway. And if they didn't, it was to implement one of those. The only major thing was to get a 12 lead EKG, relatively early. And then from a blood pressure standpoint, we had both norepinephrine and epinephrine infusions. And so we would strongly encourage them to use a vasopressor infusion, for post-ROSC care, as long as if they were profoundly hypotensive. So.
Wonderful. I don't see any other new hands or any other questions in the chat. Does anybody have any final questions or comments? All right, thank you very much. We really, really appreciate your talk.